Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the heck in the world you are. It is Monday. It is 10 a.m. on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And you know what time it is? It is time for the Sirius Report. And guys, look, here's the deal. With all the crazy stuff that's going on in the world, you need somebody who's going to make sense of it all. And for that, one of the individuals that we turn to over here at Rogue Money is none other than the man, the myth, the legend that is known as London Paul, who was previously known as Holland Paul because he was on vacation. Now he's back. He's back to his official London Paul moniker. So, Paul, welcome back, buddy. How are you?
I'm very well, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone who's listening.
Absolutely, man. And folks, I was just saying, get on the subscriber list for a special subscription service that London Paul has over at the Sirius Report. If you haven't done so already, for less than the price of a latte at Starbucks, you're going to get daily briefings of the most important topics, the most important subjects, real behind the scenes analysis on what is going on. So go to thesiriusreport.com, and that's spelled Sirius. Did I spell that right? Because I'm so foggy, Paul.
Yes, no, that's correct. That's
thesiriusreport.com and subscribe. With that being said, also subscribe to this channel and make sure you hit the subscribe button and the notification bell as well. And London Paul's YouTube channel, The Sirius Report, as well. Paul, where do we begin?
Well, I actually thought we'd kind of begin by, in essence, taking a kind of 20,000 feet view of what's going on in the Middle East, why it's been so significant, and why we're seeing kind of, I don't like to use Trump administration policy or Washington policy, but kind of cabal policy shifting away. So we can kind of go through what's happened and then sort of plug into why the cabal effectively have jettisoned the Middle East to a large extent, and why they're doing what they're doing now, and actually, unfortunately, how it's detrimental to the US. But I think what we can say, there's clear evidence the US has lost a lot of influence in the Middle East. I mean,
Tremendous.
they've largely backed away from Saudi Arabia. No, we're not really hearing anything regarding updates on these arms deals, which I think will all disappear into the ether. There's no, excuse me, there's no real initiatives between Washington and Israel. There was no movement of the embassy to Jerusalem, etc., etc. It's all very passive relationship. Washington's still saying they, steadfastly maintain this stance over a two-state solution with, Palestine.
Yeah.
The US militarily is largely backed out of Syria and Iraq. I know there's some influence in northern Syria still with regards to bases, but I think that's going to be short-lived. The Iraqis are already sort of losing their patience with the Americans post-Mosul and want them out. It's clearly obvious the US has lost influence in Qatar, say Bahrain and Oman, for example. So the obvious question is who's replacing in the vacuum now? No prizes for guessing. That's obviously China, Iran, and Russia, primarily. Now, what we're seeing with China is it's now beginning to figure in a diplomatic role in the Middle East in conjunction with Russia. But also China's looking at being part of a whole rebuilding process in Syria. The Assad government is very happy to see the Chinese involved in that. They want to also include Russia and Iran. Well, why those three nations? Now, interestingly, we know overtly why with Iran and Russia, but we've always said covertly China had a big presence in Syria, and clearly they must have had an even bigger presence than perhaps many people have realized, given that, Syria regards China, Iran, and Russia as being key nations in the rebuilding process in Syria in the future. Sorry, just let me clear my throat. So we note that, Assad's chose these nations because of the support. So what will China provide? Well, China's going to invest billions of dollars to rebuild the infrastructure, and Syria is going to become a conduit of the One Belt, One Road initiative in the Middle East. There's no doubt. If you look at it geographically where it is, it's a perfect conduit in that regard. It's also a great conduit to go into Turkey and beyond in the future, maybe regarding pipelines, etc. So, in essence, the post 9/11 US foreign policy has failed because Iraq's no longer under the influence of the US. Iraq's rebuilt relations with Iran, which was there was the whole idea from the Iran-Iraq war was to have these two nations warring and feuding. Well, that's gone out the window. And the conflicts in Syria and Iraq have brought these nations together as well as Turkey. Whereas, relations were quite tense previously between those nations as well. And the fact that the US thus far has opposed the One Belt, One Road is also clearly played into China's hands, because by failing to cooperate with China, the US is losing out in a major way economically in the Middle East, because these nations are going, well, this is the future. We don't see the US supportive of this, but China's supportive, obviously, of the One Belt, One Road. So is Russia and so is Iran. So we want to, to team up with these nations. And also US foreign policy over Korea has damaged relations with its allies in the Middle East, and China's economic leverage is always going to win out in that regard. So, and we are increasing, and we will see, and we've spoken about this previously with regards to China, that they will play a very large diplomatic role. Yes, they're going to also provide an economic role, but we've started to see that they are having some sphere of influence in the Middle East. And Libya is another great example where they started to say, look, we want to get involved in a process of rebuilding the nation and repairing the huge damage that, the US coalition forces created in a post-Gaddafi world. So then, obviously, we've spoken about China. Then we look at Russia, and it's a major game player in the Middle East. I mean, we've said before, it has military capabilities the West doesn't have. The S-400 missile defense systems, tanks, aircraft, everyone in the Middle East wants it. They've got huge geopolitical clout now, and also additionally, they have huge energy resources. And Russia does what it does extremely well. It forms strong alliances, in this case, the Middle East, whilst not angering a single nation in the process. And if you look at Saudi and Qatar in the current climate, it's a classic where they can build relationships with both nations simultaneously. And neither party has a problem with that with respect to the other nation. I don't think I've ever seen any other nation do this so deftly, as opposed to apart from Russia, should I say.
Yeah.
And Russia's role in Syria has been, a catalytic event. Sorry, my throat's a bit croaky, so hang on. It now has a naval base, obviously, presence. It's going to build military bases inside Syria with Assad's blessing on long-term agreements. And whilst Russia will obviously be less involved in the infrastructure rebuild, but obviously there's a focus on energy. And of course, what does Russia have geopolitically in that respect? It's a non-OPEC nation. So it's perfect. And Russia's strengthening ties with Iraq in terms of military cooperation, but it can also assist with energy projects. So it's a win-win for all. Once again, all these relationships is Middle Eastern nations going, hang on, we're not under kind of the foot of the US administration. Well, these are all win-win projects. We can all benefit. It's fantastic for us. And Russia is Iran's natural ally, and they continue to support them domestically as well as in Syria. We know Iran's going to join as a fully fledged member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I expect Iraq will in the future. I also would expect Syria to do so at some point in the future. We're not talking in the next 6 months or a year, but at some point I think they will do. And a great example of where Russia excels in diplomacy, as we said, is it develops these relations with Qatar. And it's able to strengthen relations with Egypt, despite the support that the Egyptians have for sanctions against Qatar, as part of these GCC nations, although that's obviously falling apart. And Russia continues also to develop relations with Saudi in a positive manner, despite obviously Qatar, as we said, and Egypt and Russia have strong military cooperation already. In terms of Libya, Russia's got strong relations. And as we said, China's now starting to come into the fold in that regard. Now, obviously, in terms of Israel, we've said it many times before, Russia's got Israel on a leash in the Middle East. And the cabal's biggest failing was the failed Turkish coup. It spun the whole thing on its head in terms of the Middle East. It reignited Russian-Turkish relationships, which were obviously had fallen apart. It also reignited the drive to keep Assad in power, and which was obviously hugely detrimental to the cabal. And as I said, all the aforementioned relationships in that region, it cemented them all. And and US-Turkish relations fell off the cliff edge as a result of the coup. And then, of course, why the US backs the Kurds in Syria just utterly beggars belief. Well, we know why they do it, because they're seeking the formation of the Kurdish state inside Syria so they can continue to exert influence in Syria via that mechanism. But there's going to be strong resistance to that.
Well,
Turkey is,
Paul, we like to support sabotage. That's our biggest export. I realize it's not trash, it's not pornography, it is actually sabotage, Paul.
Well, very sadly, I mean, I have to be careful when we say this because it's not the average American who supports this. It's not. It's the cabal, it's the deep state, however you want to put it, who've hijacked the US government and hijacked US foreign policy.
Right.
But, as Turkey continues to rotate east, as the West angers them ever more, and the US keeps angering Turkey and drives them further and further east. And, in a sense, Russia's been this diplomatic conduit that brings ties between Turkey and Iran via the Syrian peace process. I mean, without overstating the point, they're master tacticians at that. And also over Qatar and the whole situation where they kept them calm in the face of the Saudi sanctions. And Qatar's now beginning to win through by realizing you don't have to go all guns blazing to deal with the problem. And sadly, who are the big losers in this whole process? The US. Yeah. I mean, undoubtedly they are. Turkey remains a bit of a fly in the ointment in the region, but Russia's still bringing them into the fold with nations who it still sees as adversaries. It still has certain issues with Syria and Iraq, principally obviously over the whole Kurdish issue. But as ever, this all revolves around the One Belt, One Road, and we've said it before, but it is effectively the backbone of this multipolar world, and nations in the Middle East are now saying, okay, well, we have a choice. Do we join the multipolar world and reap the benefits of the changes coming, or do we seek to sit outside and be isolated and ultimately implode? And they're going, no, we're not going to do this. So why is all this important? Well, as we've seen the rapid demise of Washington inside the Middle East, and it was obviously its huge playground in the past, it now has to go somewhere else and say, well, if our relations have failed in the Middle East and we can't strike deals and make money in the process, where are we going to make money from? Well, we're going to have to strike energy deals. Someone I know, we're going to have to go and strike energy deals with Europe, with LNG. So they obviously embarked on this crazy policy of saying, well, effectively, we're going to have to in some way force Europe into accepting our gas, even though it's more expensive. But the crazy part was, in order to do this, they had to kind of put these sanctions in place on Russia, which would affect the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, as we know and we've discussed before. But the relevant point is that in the process of doing this, all they've done is antagonize Europe in the main. There are exceptions like Poland and Romania who seem to be staying loyal to the US, but the vast majority of Europe's going, we're not tolerating this, and you're not going to force us to adopt your energy policy. So in the process, in terms of, and this is not, I don't believe, is a kind of straightforward Trump policy, administration policy. They must realize it's flawed in the extreme to do this, but rather like the failed Turkish coup, it totally changed the map of the Middle East, and rather like the failed Ukraine coup in a sense, even though, they overthrew Yanukovych in the process, all they managed to do was actually strengthen Russia and China on the One Belt, One Road, and we're seeing the One Belt, One Road strengthen further in the Middle East and in the process. By the US policy and what they're trying to do with Europe, all they're going to do is drive Europe away from the US. In the process, it'll weaken the whole sanctions against Russia because nations will realize we can, and they already are saying, we've had enough of them, but if you're going to endanger our energy policy and force us to adopt LNG, we're not going to tolerate it. So in the process, the cabal or the deep state in the US is isolating itself in terms of Europe. And this is the reason we've gone through this whole process to explain, okay, this is where the big changes are. This is what's happening. When people say, well, I don't see any changes, nothing's changed, nothing's happened. These are enormous changes that we've seen in the last 3 years. The Ukraine, as we said, changed the whole format of the One Belt, One Road. It accelerated the process of de-dollarization via Russia and China, who went on around the world and built all these strong relations with any nation who was prepared to listen and wanted to be part of that process. The Turkish coup was, in essence, really the catalyst for a massive changes in the Middle East. And we've now seen the situation with regards to Qatar, where the Saudis clearly thought the US would support them, and they're not going to support them, and they're already trying to back off. And hopefully a lot of the tension's been taken out of Qatar. There are still problems, and we shouldn't overlook them. But these are huge geopolitical changes where we're seeing effectively the climb down of the cabal, who had a vested interest to try and cause massive disruption in Russia that failed. They wanted to then seek to cause huge disruption in the Middle East by a Turkish coup, which failed. If it had succeeded, then possibly we'd have been having a very different conversation at this point in time than we are now. But geopolitically, those huge changes have come out, and now the last kind of line of defence is Europe. And of course, in the process, all they're doing is upsetting Europe hugely with regards to the whole idea of sanctioning Russia. Now, we've still got problems because on the one side, Germany's threatening now to retaliate with counter sanctions against the US, which would set up this incredible trade war between the US and Europe, which you couldn't believe would be possible and it could happen. But that's where it could likely head. But in the next breath, we've had this whole issue with Siemens and these turbines being ultimately ending up in Crimea. And now elements within Berlin are saying, well, we may have to consider additional sanctions against Russia. So there's this incredible contradiction, and we will keep seeing this contradiction coming out of administrations and governments simply because the cabal effectively have lost control of governance. So at times you'll see odd things which seem to suggest a government's in alignment with their policy, and then in other situations they're completely non in alignment. And you'll see this increasingly because there is this vacuum effectively being created in the process of their influence over governments on the way. But critically, I think what the US approach with regards to Europe is failing miserably, and this is the next kind of leg where the catalytic effect in terms of the Turkish coup was self-evident, as we've seen in a very short space of time. You know, we're talking just over 12 months, these huge changes that have come about. And in the process within Europe, we've spoken a long time about what I've termed the kind of Berlin, Moscow, Beijing axis, which we then slotted Tehran in. I think we can start to slot part of the Middle East into that. And that angle of Berlin joining officially with Moscow is going to just gather momentum and gather pace precisely because the deep state, the cabal in Washington, is trying to force the European Union or the European nations' hands in terms of trying to drive a wedge between them and Russia, which isn't going to happen because they realise they've suffered enough. I mean, if Ukraine wasn't bad enough in terms of what the sanctions have damaged European economies, and nations are realising, do you know, even if sanctions are over, we're probably not going to get the business back from Russia, because Russia, in the meantime, for the last 3 years, has developed all these new relations with other nations. They've taken their trade to those nations, as well as imposing sanctions on Europe. Their agricultural produce is going elsewhere. And in the process, these nations are going to say, well, we've had it, because Russia isn't going to turn its back on its new trading partners. Why would they? There's absolutely no need to. And it would be deeply damaging for them to do so. So Europe is already learning a very painful lesson from Ukraine, and it's looking at the whole situation with the US going, we can't afford to have you dictating to us. But in the process, if they set a trade war up between the US and Europe, which is quite likely to happen, there's only going to be end at one loser, it'll be the US. And in the process, unfortunately, the US is isolating itself more and more. And there are encouraging signs coming out of the US all the time in terms of some of the domestic policy, where you feel that the Washington Beltway is not really exerting much influence. But when you look at the foreign policy, you clearly see concerns. And the problem is, and this is the perverse nature, on the one hand, you've got Trump, who sat there going, well, I really like Putin. I like the guy. And Putin seems to be quite warming to him on a personal level. I think that, it's a realization. Trump knows the whole Russia story regarding the elections, and everything else is rubbish, and everyone knows it's rubbish, and it's just a gigantic distraction, which I think maybe we could talk about shortly in another context. But in respect of that, he wants to build these relations, and he's trying to, and then in the next breath, he's having this foreign policy decision kind of rammed down his throat, which are completely contradictory and are very damaging in terms of Russia. And whilst the Russians realise and appreciate what's going on, the problem they have is they're going, well, it's for you to sort out. We can't deal with the problems you have in your own nation. And then we're not going to hang around waiting for you to resolve those problems.
No. And, you know, the thing is, Paul, if you look at what's happening here, every single person that has any sort of scruples about foreign policy within the Trump administration, they're either sold out to the old paradigm. They're either holdouts from the neocon way of thinking. They have no understanding of what the real international scope is. These are idiots who do not understand that the unipolar world that they were born into no longer exists in its current state. That is a multipolar world where the United States no longer calls the shots. And I think this is the biggest reason why there's so much stumbling and mumbling that is happening. I think one of the best things that Donald Trump can do is actually listen to shows like this in order to understand what the heck is really going on in the world, internationally speaking, Paul. And I'm very serious when I say that.
Well, no, I know perfectly well why you're saying it, because the reality is all we're doing is presenting the facts, what's happened. And when I first started, it's interesting, when I first publicly started talking about the fact that there was going to be this Berlin-Moscow kind of Beijing-Tehran axis, people saying it's impossible, it'll never happen. When we explain what would happen, that Ukraine would fail and it would backfire on the cabal, people didn't accept it, didn't believe it was possible. They didn't see the whole reorientation in the Middle East. But now people are beginning to really see it. And yet the problem is, I'm sure there's elements within the US who fully understand and can see what's happening. But the problem is that the US has had this policy for decades of kind of anti-Russian, anti-Chinese, and they're kind of tentatively going, well, who are we going to side with? Is it Russia or is it China? And sometimes you kind of feel they're moving towards Russia. Oh no, then they're trying to move towards China. Then they upset China with the whole trade agreement that fell apart last week and is now in disarray. And the problem is they don't realise they can be friends with both of them. But they just have to take that quantum leap and say, you know what, we just have to throw away the principles of the last God knows how many decades of policy towards, Russia and China, and say we have to turn over a new leaf and realize that's the future. And if we embrace the future, we stop squabbling with the world in terms of how we want to export LNG. Let's talk to the Russians and the Chinese and other nations and say, okay, we need to economically reinvigorate our nation. How can we work together? Yeah, we have all this LNG and we'd like to export it. But who can we set agreements up with? Maybe we could export LNG to other parts of the world instead of trying to stomp all over Europe in the process and upsetting them, and have a more cohesive attitude and response to how we can better relations. And someone has to make that judgment and just take the step over the line, that red line, and go, this is how we're going to adopt things in the future. And then the US can start to become a strong nation amongst equals. But the problem at the moment is, with all the best will, no matter how much in reality, the Trump administration or a lot of them, and I think particularly Tillerson is the one who stands out more than anyone, who really does see the position, but his ability to influence the inner circle is diminished, and as a consequence, he's kind of a lone voice in the wilderness. But certainly I don't see that it's beyond the wit of Washington to make these changes. But then the problem they have is, if they do this massive 180 and start to say, well, let's embrace Russia and let's embrace China, the US people are going to turn around and go, hang on, all we've had for the last, 8-9 months now is this endless Russophobic attitude. The Russians are involved in the hacking, they're involved in influencing the election. Now, I know increasingly a lot of American people are going, well, this is ridiculous and we don't believe it. But in essence, and you made the point earlier on, this is the situation they're going to have to tackle it pretty hard, because whilst every end and turn they try to push this angle about Russia and it fails, and now they're after Kushner, and I find that kind of interesting. I think they're pushing Kushner not because they really want to get rid of him, but I think they're pushing him hoping he'll crack and he might say something that they could be used, as leverage against Trump. I think that's what the angle is, but there is nothing. There isn't. The Russians didn't hack the election. The Russians aren't trying to influence US politics. there weren't some covert, relations going on between the Russian ambassador and whoever else. But the problem is they're going to have to translate that into putting an end to it. And of course, why is this whole Russophobic attitude come about? It's precisely because the Democrats lost the election and they went, okay, we've lost the election. Hang on. If we're not careful, suddenly the microscope's going to be all over what we've been doing. We're going to have to shift the narrative and make people go, oh, the Russians, it's the Russians, because they know on a certain level, people in the US are going to go, hang on, what's this about Russia? What are they doing? And whilst increasing numbers don't believe it, they still think there's sufficient traction for people in Russia to believe this is people in the US to believe Russia's a problem. And they'll keep pushing this angle. Why? Because they want to deflect everything away from what the Democrats have been involved in. What's gone on with the email servers of the DNC? What have they been up to? What's the Clinton Foundation really been up to? Whereas that's where the investigation should be, and that's where they're trying to push the narrative to get the investigation away from that. And in the process, unfortunately, a lot of the Republicans are just buying the kind of whole Russiagate, Russophobic angle and believing there's a reality to it, and are getting distracted from where the focus should be. Because if you shift the focus back to where it should be and who really is being the problem, where all the issues do lie in the US, then you immediately then not only put the focus back on where it should be, but then people are going to start going, okay, so Russia really isn't the problem. Okay, so I'm not going to be so adverse to the US starting to rebuild and strengthen ties with Russia. And in the process, also, I think part of the policy and why there's all this contradictory behavior with Russia and contradictory behavior with China is that on some level, the deep state cabal kind of are totally adverse to this, but they also realize in some senses they have to take sides. But their belief is they have to take sides, and the policy has always been to try and divide Russia and China. Well, that can't happen anymore, and they fail to see that. But that's why there's this kind of pulling in different directions, trying to sever them and try to create some kind of division between those two nations. And of course, it's an absolute fallacy. It will never happen. And there's no desire, because Russia and China know full well that that's been the policy for a long time. And yeah, there was a time in the past where they kind of fell for it to some extent, but for a long time now they haven't, and their relationship is as strong as any two nations can be on planet Earth. I mean, of that there's no doubt, and they have very much joined up thinking and in terms of planning and policy, and they have a very similar viewpoint that if you're going to win the war, you don't win it by going out all guns blazing. You build solid relations. And yes, unfortunately in Syria they've had to resort to military action, but then they're not the military actions against these terrorist groups, and that's being polite calling them terrorist groups, whoever they were funded by is irrelevant, but the reality is people will accept that in the world and go, well, actually getting rid of a scourge that's endemic and is spreading across the world and needs to be dealt with, and nations will tolerate that. Russia hasn't stomped in and tried to remove a government from a country or anything like that. So that's the big difference, and why Russia's accepted to do that. But on an international stage, Russia and China now dominate, and people are listening to them. And even, the Saudis are prepared to listen to the Russians with respect to Qatar, and vice versa. And they can build and build bilateral relations with both nations simultaneously. And Qatar's going, we see Russia as a great partner in the future, and we want to work with them in terms of energy and in other aspects. And in the meanwhile, the Saudis say the same thing. And even though those two nations are obviously have this huge friction between them, they'll both tolerate it. You can't give a nation any more praise than their ability to do that. And China's very much doing that as well, although they're less involved militarily, but they are joining the diplomatic fold, and between them, they're going to have a huge influence over nations. And that influence isn't going to happen in Europe now, but at some point it will gradually start to creep into the European mentality. We are seeing relations between some Eastern European nations and Russia and China start to grow. But the kind of big heavyweights in terms of Germany, France, Holland, and nations like that in Europe, you'll start to see those relationships gel and mold. And then the whole backbone of the One Belt, One Road, which is the whole Berlin, Moscow, Beijing, or Tehran, Beijing axis, which eventually will stretch all the way across from Lisbon in the west, in Portugal to Vladivostok in the east, and north and south of that will embrace that whole continent. And and in the process, the US can be part of that. The maritime route can extend to the US. I mean, if you look at the west coast of the US, it's perfectly primed in respect to China, and also with respect to, obviously, you've got Alaska, not that far away. When you put new kind of internal transportation routes with rail into it figures the US can be part of it. They can also extend, north to Canada and obviously south to Central America and South America. But to be part of that process, it's going to have to change drastically how those nations and the world perceives them. And it's not difficult, but it's the quantum leap in terms of how governance goes. Well, okay, we can do this, but in the process, what are the people of our country going to say to us? Hang on, you've suddenly done this complete flip, and you're now going to work with these nations when you've been telling us for decades and beyond that these are the enemy, these are a problem. We have to go around and impose our will on these nations because they have, less than credible governments, etc., and whatever, and all the reasons we know weren't reality. And that's the problem. When you dig yourself a deep hole, it's going to be hard to climb out of. But it's a big challenge. But I think the US people, by and large, will be up for the challenge. I think they want to rebuild America. They're very, people are very proud of their nation, and rightly so. And they want, and I'm not trying to sound all nationalistic, but the US needs that kind of strength of character where people in the nation want to help rebuild it. And it's perfectly reasonable to do it. Just sit down with the Chinese and say, okay. And then we had all these disagreements about tariffs. We realize it's complete nonsense. It's not going to work. Okay, let's be sensible about this and say, how can we reinvigorate trade, between the Chinese and the US? So there has been this huge imbalance. There's no doubt about that. But that's not the Chinese fault. I mean, part of the problem was the Clinton era, where they decided to export all their business east to China. Why? Because they could make produce a lot cheaper and therefore make more profits. But in the end, it was going to backfire on them. And of course, a mere 17, 18, whatever years later, it has done very badly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, the thing is this, man, it's, I'm starting to realize that, we have a short window here to get things correct in this country, a very short window. I'm looking favorably upon the 2018 midterm elections to see a lot of these guys who are the problems, Paul, a lot of these guys to be voted out of office. Then we have another 4 years. And I think that unless the idiotic elements that are in the American political parties, both sides, these establishment, deep state / neocon, neoliberal individuals are completely purged and their ideologies, dashed on the dust heap of history, then after these 8 years are done, we stand a chance to go back to the same problems that we faced leading up to the 2016 election. So my fear is that, what then? What is America eventually going to succumb to the stupidity of a failed philosophy, Paul? Like, what is your take on that?
Well, you make some very good points. I mean, the midterm elections might be a huge positive step in the right direction. I think actually dealing with the problems in the US instead of focusing on the Trump administration, and apparently, they may once have met a Russian or walked past him in the street 5 years ago is a problem. Let's start to deal with the real deep-seated corruption. I mean, and we're talking about the US. It stands across the world. I mean, that's a universal problem. But I mean, everything's event-driven, and therefore there is a huge amount of changes that need to happen. I mean, I'm not putting timescales on anything because I don't have it, because it's pointless, because it doesn't work that way. But I do think potentially 2018, there could be a lot of big changes happening. It's not the end, it's not the beginning, it's not the middle, it's just part of the process. Now, in terms of the US, that could very much be figure into that equation in that regard. If there's a way of getting rid of the elements that they're career politicians who serve an agenda, and they're probably being paid very handsomely for doing so. In that respect, that has got to change and end, because therefore that will reorientate the US into a more positive direction. But in the process, of course, we also have the issue that, in terms of broad economics, no one can really say how much longer the whole Ponzi Western financial system can withstand. I mean, that's been creaking since 2007, really, never mind 2008. So how much longer can that be held together? I mean, that's a big risk. And of course, if we have serious problems in that, it might make my idea of things happening in 2018 as part of this large process may start to come back in and move in towards 2017. I mean, we're in July now, so we've got 5 months, and there's always talk, well, something might happen in March or something may happen in October, because historically things have happened. But there's no point putting timescales on it, and people who say something's going to happen on a certain day really in reality don't understand that it has nothing to do with dates, and it's just very sensationalistic, and it sounds great to get people to read what you're saying, but there's no reality to dates. But very much so, the US has to change it politically, internally, and I think it probably has far more problems than any other nation in that regard in terms of the change. I mean, for sure, the US political system needs turning on its head, but I think turning that oil tanker around is going to be a lot easier than turning the oil tanker around in the US. Certainly there's inroads being made, but it's really important that the focus goes away from all this idea about Russia, and the focus switches to the real people who are the real problems. And it doesn't matter whether they're Democrat or Republican or anything else, just start to deal with the real problems and make it where that is the focal point. And also in the process, of course, if the problem you're going to have is the US has got to reorientate its whole fiscal policies, and there's all these tax reforms. It's got to try and balance the budget. There's all the debt ceiling, all these kind of problems that are rearing their head, and that needs addressing as well. And to me, looking from the outside into the US, all I see is all this fixation with Russia, and not a lot of substance with regards to dealing with economic issues. And the problem is, in the process of trying to reorientate and balance the US economy and find a way, they're all starting to look at nations like China and go, well, we're going to have to impose tariffs, and China will just in the end go, well, fine, we'll just take our business elsewhere. And by the way, we might not have some, future trade agreements with you like we do now. That's hugely damaging to the US. It needs to get away from that and say, okay, what do we need to really do to reinvigorate and stimulate the US economy? And maybe you're going to have to swallow their pride and say to the Chinese, do you know what? Why don't you come and invest in the country? I mean, there's an interesting thing I was looking into a couple of days ago, where essentially there's a body that exists in the US government that looks at acquisitions of US companies by foreign buyers. And it's called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's the CFIUS. Now, that reviews acquisitions by foreign entities for potentially national security risks. And what they've done recently, they've started to balk a lot of applications by Chinese companies. Now, interestingly, Chinese companies are eyeing US assets, and because they see that they can reinvigorate US manufacturing base and industry. And we've seen some great examples where the Chinese have gone in, taken a company over that was about to go bust, and actually reinvigorated it, and it's now employing more people and being successful. But there seems to be more emphasis now on putting these roadblocks in place to stop these Chinese companies coming in. But I think in the first 6-7 months of 2017, there was about nearly 90 US companies were basically acquired by the Chinese. Now that's a record high, and there was only about, I think, 78 deals that were carried out in the whole of 2016. So it's on the growth, but they seem to be trying to put a stop to that. Now, I agree you have to be careful when you have takeovers, but if the Chinese have got some good plan to reinvigorate businesses that are failing, then let them come in and do it. People may have to swallow their pride. People may have aversions to it and concerns about the Chinese are coming in to take over the nation. No, they're not coming in to take over the US. They don't have any interest in doing that. But it's better to have a strong, constructive relationship with the Chinese rather than this idea that everything's a threat and we're going to have to, close doors to them, because they just can't afford to do that. the US is economically too weak to turn its back on trading partners and people it can work with. And that's a classic example where there seemed to be this idea of opening the US up to acquisitions, provided they, dot all the I's and cross all the T's. But now they're pulling the drawbridge up and saying, well, actually, we're not really so keen on these deals happening anymore. But that's also detrimental to the US. So there's the political angle, as you said, and how that needs to be addressed. But there's also the economic angle. And how can we actually start to change the mindset in Washington to go, you know what? It's a different world, and we're going to have to cut our cloth accordingly. And it, in 5-10 years' time, people will turn around and say, if they do, wow, look at the US. It's a great, strong nation again economically. And it's friends with the world, and everyone likes it because America's doing what America should do and does best, not the American policy we've had for far too long that does America no favors. And of course, eventually it ran out of steam in the process, and now the world's turned around and called their bluff and said, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. In the process, they've had to back out of all this long-standing, geopolitical agenda and belief system that they've operated, and it's failed. But so therefore, it's going to be hard. But you know what? If I was sat there in Washington and I was Trump, I'd be going, I really don't care anymore about this. I care about the American people. I care about this nation, and I want to do what's right for this nation. And if we have to go to the Chinese and we have to change our philosophy and mentality towards nations like Russia, then so be it, because that is the future, and we want to be part of that future. And also, there needs to be some strong influence somewhere within the administration to get the focus away from all this Russian nonsense onto, well, where is the real problems? Who are the people in this nation who are putting these roadblocks in place? And in the past, who was responsible for all these dirty, dodgy deals that were going on and things that have happened that have been hugely, detrimental to the US as a nation? And that's an important angle that also needs to be shifted. And you're right, it has to happen kind of now. We don't want it kind of dragging on and going, well, we're getting in this, we're talking in 12 months' time going, well, we haven't seen much progress, and the rest of the world keeps moving on. And of course, the more the world moves on and the US doesn't, the more isolated the US becomes. And it sounds incredulous probably to the average person in the US who doesn't listen to these shows and doesn't understand. But that's sadly a reality, and it has to be addressed. And I think there's sufficient people in the US to do that. But it's the difficulty of just shifting the whole mindset away from this is the distraction, this is the problem, to these are the problems, and making the American people realize that these distractions are there to get away from dealing with the real problem, i.e. the people who were responsible, and instead of blaming Trump or Trump Jr. or Kushner or someone else in there like Flynn or anyone else for some dodgy dealings or something they shouldn't have been doing with the Russian. Shift that mindset. That's the absolute critical part. And you're right, someone needs to, start to deal with the real issues. And with all due respect, people like Sessions has got to start dealing with it and going, hang on, I know there's major problems in it. I know it's got nothing to do with Russia, as he said when he gave the testimony. I know where the real problems are. I'm going to start having to deal with it. Now, I know there's why people don't like to do it, because there's a history of strange things happening to people who investigate certain people in the US, as we know. But it's got to happen. And it's like anything, if enough people get behind that initiative, it will happen and it will be a success. Rather like the rest of the world spent decades frightened to the US and standing up to them, it only took one or two nations, okay, big nations like China and Russia, to do so, and the rest of the world started to go, well, we're not going to tolerate it anymore. And the deep state cabal just backed off. And that's because in reality they had no strength. The only strength they had was driving fear into other nations and fear into their own people as to what the consequences are if this action and this action and these other actions happened or didn't happen. And it's the same internally within the US. Someone has to grasp the mantle and go, these are the real problems and let's deal with it. And if they deal with it, things can move surprisingly quickly. As we're seeing on the world stage now, everything's happening very, very fast in real time. I mean, most people are there, sadly, who don't show any interest in this for whatever reason, don't see any of this. But I think people who listen to Rogue Monday and the things that you discuss all week and we discuss on Monday fully understand the massive pace of change that's coming about now. And also, you're going to get a lot of people out there who do know things, who are just focusing on unimportant things and trying to deflect from the reality of what's unfolding. And we equally need to be mindful of what their reasoning for doing is. It can be because they don't understand, or because they live in fear of some things that aren't happening. But I don't think there's any question that we have seen massive changes, particularly, I would say, probably in the last 3 years, but even more so in the last 12 months, and probably even in the last 7 months, through the course of 2017.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a lot of things in play and a lot of things in flux, and going into this year, to the end of this year, as well as 2018, will be something to be really seen. And I think you and I are going to be doing a lot of commentary the next several months as how these things come about. Paul, switching gears, recently it was, we're starting to see the situation in Venezuela deteriorate to the point where it's pure absurdity. The deep state is licking its chops, trying to intervene. One of the things that I've reported on probably over a year ago, I said that the Chinese and the Russians are very much deeply interested in saving PVSA, which is the Venezuelan oil or petroleum company, but they're not intent on helping Maduro because they know a loser and a strikeout artist when they see one. They're going to let that thing implode. What do you think is going to happen with Venezuela, especially with the oil situation there, and talks of I think either Libya and one other country joining OPEC as well?
Yeah, I think Venezuela is a classic situation. What we can say is certainly Russia, and we've spoken about this on occasions before, I have in the past, where Russia and China are most certainly trying to backstop Venezuela in terms of its people and its industry. And you're absolutely right. As a major oil producer, it's absolutely incredulous that a nation's on the verge of collapse. Now, Maduro, yes, a big problem, but I think there's been cabal influence to try and overthrow the regime, which is not the answer either. Maduro needs to go, and there needs to be proper elections, and they need to have a governance that is fit to try and turn that nation on its head. I mean, I've heard some absolute horror stories about the problems with people in terms of just basically feeding themselves, and people starving, and countless other problems. And we know it is on the verge of collapse, and it has been for a long time. I mean, its currency is devaluing faster than you can imagine. I mean, it is just an absolute mess, all told. And no doubt, yes, the cabal would love to be able to get hold of their assets for not even cents on the dollar, maybe fractions of cents on the dollar. I mean, with Russia and China looking, particularly the Chinese, to backstop the Venezuelans, I mean, for sure, I think that will alleviate some of the problems. I mean, there was also the whole issue of, well, someone's going to end up stealing all the Venezuelan gold. Well, the Chinese effectively own that and are protecting it. So that's not an issue either. But certainly Venezuela at the moment is a very precarious state. The last thing it needs is some massive overthrow and coup, because coups like that never solve anything. What it needs is a process where, yes, there are huge problems. Maduro certainly failed the Venezuelan people, of that there's no doubt. But there needs to be some process whereby it needs some governance that gets the nation back on an even keel. I mean, how you go about resolving what is another completely failed state is a debatable question. And yeah, I think it'd be very hard at this point to understand exactly what needs to be done, but certainly it needs to get out of this whole hyperinflationary spiral that's destroying the economy. It needs to be able to have some proper governance in terms of resolving some of the immediate problems. And Maduro's not going to succeed in doing that. In terms of what happens with Venezuela in the future in terms of its oil and where it ends up, I mean, I think at the moment it's questionable, because China and Russia, of course, will never interfere in a nation. They might help them economically, and if a nation reaches out and wants some military assistance or to buy some military hardware, then that's wonderful, But they're not going to go in and start saying, well, actually, we advocate that this happens in terms of elections, or we suggest this happens, they just won't get involved. So, but I think with their economic influence, they will not want to see their investment in Venezuela go down the pan, so to speak. So, but for sure, it's an absolute monumental mess. And of course, the problem is the worry is that the US will decide to interfere in Venezuela, and it's the last thing it should do either in the process. But I think there is a risk of that happening, and that will solve nothing in the process either. But for sure, and Venezuela is a classic example of a nation that was so rich in resources and had been utterly failed domestically, politically, and socially in the process.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Well, we're coming up to the last 4 minutes of the show. Why don't you give out your information, how people could follow you, your social media, as well as your subscription services, and your most importantly, let's start first with your closing thoughts.
Well, closing thoughts. I think today was a good opportunity to take that 20,000 feet view, look at what's happened, how things are geopolitically changing, why we're seeing things happening in the Middle East the way they are, why things are changing in terms of Europe, and how it all fits in terms of the whole really multipolar world shift, and how the US is the position it's currently finding itself in. As ever, focus on what Russia, China do. Whatever they're doing is going to give you a pretty good barometer. Not at every detail, of course, but it gives you a fairly good idea of what's unfolding in the world. But we need to start paying attention, and we do obviously, to what the US is doing in terms of its domestic policy and foreign policy. Domestically, it's got a lot of challenges coming up in terms of balancing its budget. I mean, a lot's made about the debt ceiling, and it's all a bit of kabuki theatre, but there are issues to do with this, which I think will unfold in due course, and certainly we have to keep an eye in terms of the US foreign policy and how they desperately need to change in that angle. So it's an ongoing thing, but if we're going to focus on the US, we also have to focus on the rest of the world, because the one thing about the multipolar world is everything's becoming very interactive, and nations are no longer, and in fact they haven't been isolated or islands for a very long time, but less so. So what happens in the Far East, what happens in the Middle East, what happens in Europe is very much going to play out, not just in those jurisdictions, but elsewhere in the world, because that's the way the world's moving. And yes, it's important that we don't lose sight of what goes on in the US, and that's why we do cover things and talk about it. But we have to take the broader understanding of what's going on, because without that, we're missing some key elements and big things that are changing, that are having a huge influence on the US. For example, the whole change of emphasis in the Middle East is very much had a big influence on the US, and how they've now changed their policy in terms of who they're going to deal with and how they're going to deal with it. So it very much is changing the face of geopolitics globally, and we can't ever just turn our back on any nation. I mean, yes, some nations are going to be far less important than others in the grand scheme of what's happening, but when we see China doing some trade deals with some very obscure nations, some others a good reason for it. And if you follow the kind of train of thought as to what that means, there's generally some very good reason for it. And you'll then see geopolitically how that part of the puzzle all fits together in the bigger puzzle, which is the multipolar One Belt, One Road initiative. And just very briefly, someone sent me a message saying, well, how do we know that the One Belt, One Road and the Chinese-Russian initiatives are going to be any different to the Western policy of,
oh my God, really?
Death, destruction, and grand larceny? Well, it's a good question, because I think it's something that people are naturally a little bit fearful of. And that the reality is, just look at how the policy works. It's a win-win for nations. They're not stomping into nations and deciding to take control. Nations are embracing all these new strategic relationships they're having with China and Russia, because they know it's a win-win. We never saw that kind of emphasis. I mean, you didn't see the US coalition forces going into Libya and into Syria and into Iraq and Afghanistan and places like that, and seeing nations falling over themselves welcoming the US coalition forces. Quite the opposite. There was huge resistance. We're not seeing the resistance, and that really is the answer to the question very succinctly. But anyway, I kind of digress, but it just suddenly came into my head, so I thought I'd mention it. In terms of, obviously, we've got the website, the SiriusReport.com, SIRIUS. And yes, we do have the premium subscription service, which is $4.75 a month. We think it's very good value. We do put a lot of comprehensive information in there. We don't what we discuss on that. We don't discuss publicly elsewhere because people pay for a service. You have to protect the information they're given. I know some people disagree with that, but if people pay for a service, you have to respect the fact they've paid for it. But we think it's good value, and you effectively get 22 podcasts a month. It's 5 a week, and it's very packed information. It's very condensed. It's minimal use of words from my perspective to try and get as much information in a kind of 10-15 minute window, which is what each podcast is. Although obviously it's a bit longer if we do a double podcast, which sometimes we do. And yes, there's the Facebook page, which is the Sirius Report. We're in the process of trying to close the Facebook group down, but realised in fact we have to delete every single member before we can do so. So there's a monumental job deleting thousands of users in the process, but we're closing that because it doesn't serve any purpose anymore, and we think the Facebook page is a far better way forward of doing it. People can still be interactive, and we have obviously the Twitter page, which is at the Sirius Report, and basically thanks to Rogue Money for getting us on in the first place, and we really love doing the shows each week, and it's given us a lot more exposure, and we're very grateful for that. And the great thing with Rogue Money is everybody's working to the same goals, and we want to just get the truth and the reality of things, no matter how. And sometimes people don't like what you say. I get sometimes people saying that I didn't like what you say. I go, well, yes, but it's reality, and it's better to face reality than face illusions that people think things are going to happen that aren't. Does it mean that we're not going to succeed? Yes, we will, but it's a long, drawn-out process, and these changes are not going to happen overnight, and that's just a stark reality. But if you'd said to me back in 2013, prior to Ukraine, and in all honesty, thank goodness no one ever asked me the question, how long is this going to take? I would have said it would take 10, 15, maybe more years. We were so far behind where we needed to be, but the acceleration in the last 3 years has been astonishing, and for that I'm extremely grateful that the cabal made some huge mistakes, because it has accelerated that process. But there's still a long way to go, but you just never know. You might see some event that happens that sets a whole catalytic chain and speeds a whole series of events that may take years, and suddenly they get compressed into months. So we can't say, and that's why timescales are pointless.
Yeah, absolutely. With that being said, Paul, thank you so much for joining with us again and sharing your thoughts, especially with all the events that are going on in this world as things are going on fast and furious. Folks, we'll be back here next week as well, next Monday for another Sirius Report with London Paul. Thank you all for listening in. Enjoy your weeks and enjoy your weekends. Take care and God bless.